How are you? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Eric Kahn. I'm one of the design faculty here at SCI-Arc. I'd like to welcome you to the second lecture in our fall 1998 lecture series. Before introducing David, I'd like to put forth a series of critical questions framing the subject matter in question and introduce some issues regarding interdisciplinary work, in this case surrounding current researches involving globalization and world cities. Slide. Perhaps two of the most startling global prophecies from the first half of the 20th century, both radically complete global views, were produced by Buckminster Fuller and Hannes Meyer. Slide. The Fuller projection Dymaxion map of 1934 was the first non-privileged, non-hierarchical, and recombinant view of the global surface. Following centuries of cartography where a centered point of view was always privileged, with the to-be-charted areas moving towards the periphery. The Fuller projection yields the least amount of continental distortion of any two-dimensional mapping technique to date. It's transnational, and it's an index of Anthony Giddens' concept of disembedment. Slide. For a seminal example of a global city, let's revisit Hannes Meyer's co-op vitrine project of 1925. It was at once logical, ideological, technological, and indexical. More than mere progress and beyond modernization, more than a Fordist display of mass production, it was a dry Apollonian prophecy of globalization. The world city and a world system in one diagram. Slide. Hit the start button to begin flows. Compare it to the Dionysian ecstasy and excess of Norman Bell Getty's Futurama exhibition some 15 years later. Meyer's flows of product index production means, while technically the products arranged vertically suggest iconographically a new city, the end of X, Y, and Z. Centers of command and control, Saskia Sassen would say. The global metropolis transforms symbolic city structures into indexical infrastructures. All that is solid is product, all that is information is air. Slide. Frictions. The world is tending towards a single whole, toward the interconnection and globalization of economic, technological, ecological, and social conditions. This accelerated process, as a result of globalization, does not, however, imply that social and cultural traditions and opportunities throughout the world are moving into line with each other. On the contrary, globalization and interdependence, are taking place in a highly asymmetrical, asynchronous, and conflict-laden manner. The wildly dynamic fault lines between the first, second, and third worlds, relatively latent and controlled during modernity, now erupt anew. The move towards a transnational Europe, the EC, and the counter-tendency of our failed NAFTA exemplifies the divergent tendencies of coalition building and a swift change from borders to zones compared with the isolationist and border-emphatic North America contra the world. Juxtapose Bosnian genocide as fierce declarations of independence with the fall of the Berlin Wall, both post-Cold War, both global. These are certainly diverse vectors. Historians, sociologists, urbanists, architects, economists, politicians, the list could go on, have all been studying the entity we call city for centuries. Perhaps the recent shift, however, since 1960, has been contextualizing the city as a transnational node within the interrelated global network of world cities. This shift marks the continued advancement of the Gesellschaft, coalitions of global contracts, over the Gemeinschaft, society of blood or national identities. I think, to me, the question that I'm grappling with as an architect is really the question, is globalization a part of Western modernity? Is it even a project, or is it simply a process? And if it's one or the other, it has implications to the production of architecture. The terms modernity, modernization, postmodernity, and globalization are by no means interchangeable. However, they are related. For example, where modernity couples progress with morality into a master narrative, it is highly striated. Globalization is smooth, shifting, and is qualified by complete indifference and autonomy from history and narrative making. Where modernity's project sought to impose order on chaos, ideological and exclusive, globalization, indifference, topples the current nation-state regime and implies and tries to impose chaos on order. Consider the Y2K problem and the term crisis summit in this context. To be sure, globalization is both insidious and complex. Like the Greek god Hermes, we're never really sure if his intent is to inform or deceive. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce David Smith, Associate Professor of Sociology from UC Irvine. Professor Smith has authored numerous articles and books, including A New World Order, Global Transformations, published in, I believe, in 1996, which he co-edited with Jay Barouz. Additionally, he has presented numerous papers all over the world. I first became aware of his work through careful study of his essay, Cities and Global Matrices, toward mapping the world system, city system, which he co-authored with Michael Timberlake. And I hope he will further the discussion tonight. Please welcome David Smith.
I'm going to take my jacket off. I figured that since I was being paid, I should wear a tie and a jacket, but now you've seen it and I've hung it up. I want to thank Eric first for the introduction and for the invitation. As a comparative sociologist, my work is rather wide-ranging, as he kind of indicated. I'm basically using a world system analysis to address various research problems, ranging from global trade to state sovereignty, environmental issues, the dynamic of democratization in developing countries. Recently, much of my research has focused on East Asia. I began a few years ago interested in the mechanisms that led to the economic miracles in East Asia. Now, like many others, I'm trying to figure out how the miracle turned into the crisis. And that's something that I'm currently doing a fair bit of research on, and have been spending some time in the field looking at the process of industrial relocation of things like the garment and textile industry in Asia. But the research that prompted Professor Kahn to invite me to speak tonight is tied to my interest in developing a global perspective on urbanization and understanding the world city system. My dissertation was on third world cities, and it was done a fairly long time ago, but it eventually turned into another book called Third World Cities and Global Perspective, which appeared, I think, also in 1996. I meant to bring a copy so I could hold it up so you could all rush to the bookstores nearby and get yourself a copy. But I've also gotten interested in both the idea of a world system of cities and how positioning in that hierarchy impacts urban development within cities. And secondly, in the distinct impact of the process of globalization, which, as we'll see, is a very slippery and often loaded term, and how that impacts on urban and regional growth patterns. Both phenomena, global city formation and globalization, tend to promote various types of uneven development and material inequality within and between cities, regions, and nations. So polarization seems to be a strong empirical trend, even in times of robust economic growth, as we've seen recently in places like the US. And that's a particularly strong trend as we approach the 21st century. The New World Order is a very unequal one. The task that confronts social scientists is to attempt to analytically approach this issue and try to unravel the complex threads that causally connect global changes to various kinds of local impacts. And tonight, in my short talk, I'm going to try to lay out some conceptual tools which may help untangle those effects. In particular, I plan to discuss how social scientists view globalization and debunk the ideological versions of that idea a little bit, and go on to describe the global city hypothesis and the notion of a world system of cities. I hope to use Los Angeles and Southern California as a backdrop. I don't have any slides, but I'll try to refer back to the ones that Eric presented on my behalf. I suppose with this idea of LA as a backdrop, you can sort of think of me as the urban sociology version of the old set of the Johnny Carson show with the lights of the city in the background. Pretty corny. I hope to use that LA is interesting not just because we all know about it, but also because it seems to be an emblematic case for the prospects and possibilities and also the pitfalls of contemporary urban development. Your own Mike Davis evocatively captures why Los Angeles is such an interesting case and a formidable challenge to contemporary urban theory in his books, The City of Quartz and The Ecology of Fear. And I should just mention parenthetically, as a sociologist in a discipline where we're all notoriously bad writers, I'm awed by the way Davis is able to capture the nuanced complexities and dynamics so elegantly. We all wish that we could write like that. Geographer Ed Soja of UCLA, who apparently is, I've been told, has spoken in one of these series before, says succinctly that it all comes together in LA. And let me just read a fairly long quote from Soja, a paper by Soja. Seemingly paradoxical but functionally interdependent juxtapositions are the epitomizing feature of contemporary Los Angeles. Coming together here are especially vivid exemplifications of many different processes and patterns associated with the societal restructuring of the late 20th century. The particular combinations are unique, but condensed within them are more general expressions and reflections. One can find in Los Angeles not only the high-technology industrial complex of the Silicon Valley and the erratic Sunbelt economy of Houston, but also the far-reaching industrial decline and bankrupt urban neighborhoods of rust-belted Detroit or Cleveland. There is a Boston in Los Angeles, a Lower Manhattan and a South Bronx, a Sao Paulo and a Singapore. There may be no other comparable urban region which presents so vividly such a composite assemblage and articulation of urban restructuring processes. Los Angeles seems to be conjugating the recent history of capitalist urbanization in virtually all its inflectional forms. In a few minutes, I'll try to come back. It occurs to me, by the way, I could have shown all kinds of slides during that, but no slide imagination among the sociologists. In a few minutes, I'm going to try to come back to try to figure out what to make of Los Angeles. But first, I want to give you my take on globalization, global cities, and the world city hypothesis. Of course, everybody talks about globalization. All you have to do is turn on the TV or pick up a newspaper or a magazine. There's all kinds of stuff about globalization. Newspaper columnists, TV reporters, politicians, and pundits. Globalization is a mantra. Often these folks do not have a very clear definition of what they're talking about. At the most generic, vague level, globalization is the idea that something's changed in the last 2 or 3 decades. That the Disney Small World exhibit, with that song we're all so annoyed by, which was first exhibited in 1964 and 65 at the New York's World's Fair, has become a reality, that we live in this small world. Technology and communication and transport have integrated the world. Other people take sort of a different slant on this, and they emphasize the economic integration and the declining importance of national economies and the rise of one world, ready or not, using the title of William Greider's 1997 book. And folks talk about a lot of things like the decline of sovereignty of states and things like that. 2 key points that I'd like to make about globalization. The first stresses something that I think is really new and empirically important, and sort of a positive lesson in this terminology. And that's what I would call time-space compression. And if I could bring back the slides, I'd put the watch back on, I guess. The idea with time-space compression is that exchanges in today's world are vastly faster than in the past. And not only are they faster, but they're actually accelerating at a faster rate. Robert Wade, who actually downplays the extent of globalization, he's a political scientist, political economist, and worldwide economic integration, nonetheless describes, quote, liquid capital ricocheting across the foreign exchanges. In the early 1990s, September 1992 to be exact, this rate of foreign currency exchange had already reached the astronomical level of $900 billion per day. $900 billion of exchange per day in global currency exchanges. And this is an investment. This is speculation on global currency. People aren't putting money into some sort of capital, into some sort of enterprise that's going to produce things. It's exchanges of currency. No wonder economists and bankers and Alan Greenspan are nervous about the spreading financial crises of the last few months. The global volatility makes the world an interesting place to live in as we look towards the new millennium. Sort of the Chinese crisis, there's possibility, but there's also a lot of danger in this kind of world with this time-space compression. The second point that I'd like to make about globalization in general, and this is more cautionary, is that the term is literally and frequently drenched with ideology. Often globalization is a code word, essentially, for a pattern of ideas that I would call global neoliberalism. It becomes an argument for the claim that there is no alternative. Some people abbreviate this as TINA, T-I-N-A. There is no alternative. Globalization is going to sweep everything away in its path across the entire globe. Often not only profoundly anti-statist, but also against any other factor that limits the freedom of business and capital to move across the face of the earth. Including things like labor unions, environmental laws, safety regulations, any kind of regulation of capital flows across the planet. Globalization, the need to stay or become internationally competitive in this ideological formulation, becomes a mantra of business and financial elites. The privatization and dismantling of states, the rise of anti-labor policies that follow may in fact, quote, grow the economy, to use our president's ungrammatical expression. But, as even the international financiers like George Soros now realize, they also generate winners and losers. And while some people get rich, many, many more are losing. My main point here is this. Globalization is the supposedly inevitable globalization that pushes all the world toward laissez-faire economies, open to world investment, is ideological. It's a program, it's an ideology. It is not based on empirical generalizations or careful social or even economic analysis. Indeed, in the wake of financial crises in East Asia and Russia and probably Latin America next and maybe here finally, there is a growing appreciation that this sort of globalization may have, in fact, gone too far. In the words of, again, the title of a book by an economist who used to work for the World Bank. So what has changed about the global economy besides this tremendous increase in transaction speed, this time-space compression I mentioned before? Well, one obvious aspect of global restructuring is a fundamentally changed global division of labor from that of the mid-20th century. Much manufacturing has moved from the core regions, the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, to peripheral third world locales. The old idea that economic growth equals industrialization now seems, frankly, quaint. Today, we see global manufacturing linked via long production chains to various parts of the world. The need to organize, coordinate, and control these far-flung manufacturing and distribution chains is where global cities come into play. Lots of the most seminal works on the idea of world cities were done by folks in Los Angeles. John Friedman and his collaborator Getz Wolf at UCLA, for instance, were the two co-authors that kind of wrote the first big piece back in the 1980s, early 1980s. But Saskia Sassen is sort of most closely associated. This is somebody that Eric mentioned in his introduction. And in particular, her 1991 book, The Global City, New York, Tokyo, and London. Although I'm also going to show you a table from another book called Cities in the World Economy. This Global Cities, New York, Tokyo, and London, big fat book, lots of statistics, not real bracing reading exactly, but it's sort of the most, again, the most comprehensive statement of the global city hypothesis. And Saskia Sassen sees four distinctive functions of global cities for the global economy. And let me just read a quote from her. First, as highly concentrated command posts in the organization of the world economy. Second, as key locations for finance and specialized service firms which have replaced manufacturing as the leading economic sectors. Third, as sites of production, including production of innovations in these leading industries. And fourth, as markets for the products and innovations produced. But like Friedman and Wolf, Sassen points to a paradox. The world city, which is sort of, world city, that sounds like a really good thing to be. It's a leading something or other. This world city is also the site of concentrated inequality. So global cities are home to high-wage executives and managers and lawyers and accountants and designers and engineers and architects who run and service global corporations. But they also are home to a growing group of poor people, underclass folks, minimum wage workers, marginal people in many different kinds of ways, as well as becoming concentrations for people of color and migrants. Leading edge sectors in the global city generate and in fact require a large support staff of low wage workers, from sweatshop manufacturing to casualized service jobs, which cater to the needs of the affluent. Maids, groundskeepers, the folks, the kind of things that we see Latinos doing in Southern California every day. Global cities, while they are leading centers for the wealth, innovation, and finance, are also then dual cities or divided cities with higher social polarization than other places that are lower in the urban hierarchy. Okay, there's something in Sassen's argument, at least, and it's an empirical issue whether she's correct, but she argues that global cities actually exacerbate these inequalities and this polarization. And she has an argument why that is. But again, the servicing of these, the wealth generates the poverty at the other end. In a similar formulation, Manuel Castells describes the informational city. And he says that these are centers for immigrants and ethnic minorities living in a new type of poverty. In Castells' view, the international business complex in these great cities are the economic engine of the entire world economy. The infrastructural requirements needed to capture these crucial flows of information are enormous. So the metropolis, places like New York and Tokyo and London and maybe Los Angeles, has a huge advantage over smaller places. The information city equals the global city, in Castells' view, as the brain, so to speak, of the global economy, where networks of dense decision-making are overlaid. Okay. Well, that's sort of the theoretical introduction. What about Los Angeles? And that's kind of, I'm sort of organizing my talk around LA because I think it's interesting, although again, people should keep in mind that it's not necessarily specific to LA. It could apply to some of these other world cities as well. But I think it helps me at least to illustrate some of these ideas. The question is LA a global city? And to what extent does this abstract urban theory apply to this place? In their original research agenda on world cities, Friedman and Wolf clearly thought LA was one of these places. In a 1986 article by Friedman, he clearly sees LA as one of the 4 or 5 core global cities. And I'm going to show you a little, show you one of his tables. This is a little map that he provides, and I don't have my little red pointer thing. Let me get my little red pointer thing. It's very clear from this that that LA is one of the 5 big ones. I mean, that's kind of all that there is in that table, basically. And you can see how it's articulated with other cities in the US and with Latin America and with the Pacific Rim a little bit. Okay, so clearly this is sort of an initial Now, Friedman isn't really using any data. He's sort of, it's his expert opinion, and he's consulting various sources, and he comes up with this schematic diagram. So later on, I'm going to talk about statistical analysis that draws lines and creates hierarchies in a more formal, methodologically sophisticated way, but that's not what John Friedman is doing. Not to say that this isn't valid, but it's just a different strategy. And also, he provides a figure in the same article that, in fact, on the next page or the facing page or something. And again, the same point here that we can see that LA is a primary core level 1 city. That level 1 just means that the population is 10 to 20 million. A lot of urban theorists have thought that population size was a good measure for position in the urban hierarchy in the past. In a 1995 paper, Friedman still ranks LA very high as a multinational articulation for the Pacific Rim. You could sort of see that in that table with the dots and the connected cities, but let me just put this up. Get this stupid things. Now it's backwards. Again, you can see that he ranks LA pretty high. And you know, these tables are kind of interesting too, because you can see how people rank other places. If there are other places that you're interested in, obviously it gives you some information. But there's LA. It's right up there. Miami is up there too. Miami is a place, by the way, that many people feel has really risen in the hierarchy and has become very important as the sort of the Latin America articulate in the United States. And some of the processes that I'm describing for LA and some of the social effects, I think people feel are present in Miami as well. Friedman's assessment are all qualitative, based on expert knowledge, but not measured in any real empirical way. Sasson tries to measure world city status with some data on stuff, and she's particularly interested in things like corporate headquarters and bank data, and this is the financial corporation data. Now, what she finds, it's very surprising for those of us who think LA is important. You can see that Los Angeles is really not very important when it comes to the headquarters of the largest financial corporations in the US. In fact, much to the dismay probably of some people in Southern California, San Francisco pretty consistently ranks ahead of LA in this measurement. And then similarly, if you look at her data on banks and bank assets, Los Angeles, a little bit better. I mean, it's a little bit higher up in the hierarchy. But you see places like Charlotte, North Carolina, that we don't think of as particularly high in the urban hierarchy, is scoring pretty high on these measures. I mean, the point is that sociologists and urban social scientists try to measure these things, and the measurements are you know, there's disputes about what's the important variable that actually captures things like the position on the hierarchy. In my own research, in this article that Eric talked about a little bit, we try to look at network data. And let me just tell you a little bit about that data. I need to be someplace where I've got light. Mike Timberlake and I, Mike Timberlake's a professor at Kansas State, tried to come up with network measures of the world city hierarchy, looking at real flows between cities. And what we've done is we've done a statistical procedure where we look at the flows and we try to rank places by their centrality in networks. We'd like to get information on investment or financial flows or other kinds of economic flows between cities. but it's very, very difficult to get data on city-to-city transactions. There's a lot of data, for instance, on nation states, you know, whether they trade with each other or whether they have various other kinds of exchanges. But cities, there's not much data. That's just not you know, it's a data problem, which doesn't concern folks like yourselves probably too much. But it's the reason why we have to stick with the kind of information we use, which is information on transportation and communication. Right now we're trying, for instance, to get phone and email exchange data between places, and we've got some leads on how to do that. And if you think about it in theory, you know, the phone company probably does have those records, and if we can pry it loose, we ought to be able to do some interesting analysis. But the easiest city-to-city data that's already compiled and collected and ready to be analyzed, is on air flight and passenger volume. And we did some statistical analysis on this, and this is a table, if people have read the article in Urban Studies that you may have already seen. This table is upside down in terms of the centrality. The scores at the bottom, these are the places that are actually high in the hierarchy. And what this measures essentially, I could have brought in a big matrix of the actual flows, but it measures which cities are most central to all the other points in the graph, as the mathematicians would say, but in this case in the World City Network. And you can see that London, Paris, New York, and Tokyo come out very high. The only kind of surprise there, I guess, is a little bit is Paris, that it comes out as high as it does. And in this measure, Los Angeles is in the top 10 among cities and ahead of all the other US cities, which is more consistent with some of the qualitative descriptions than that last table that I showed you with Sassen's data on it. Okay. All right. So there's just some empirical evidence. And again, you know, it's fun to do this kind of thing. You can argue about the measures, and people can say, well, this is the most important thing, or that is the most important thing. But basically, oh, and one other thing I'll say about our results. We've done some further analysis recently, and one interesting result, and it's not produced on that table, is that Los Angeles seems to be moving up if we look at data over time, you know, our air traffic, or our air passenger data over time. This suggests that Los Angeles' position in the hierarchy, measured by these network passenger flow measures, may be changing. It does tend to lend a little bit more support to Friedman's characterization as LA as a major global city. Also, we have some data that shows where LA's passenger flows go, and it does seem like it's an articulate to the Pacific Rim, again, supporting Friedman. Okay, at this point, I want to leave the macro level statistical measures of world city status and begin to explore what the network connections of a global city really mean at the regional and local level. Again, I'll try to stay centered on LA as the example. We've seen some mixed evidence of LA's world city status. Clearly, Los Angeles doesn't seem to be comparable to places like New York or Tokyo or London, especially if we use these economic measures of Saskia Sassen on financial headquarters or bank headquarters or whatever. But it is fair to say that LA may well be a different sort of global city. Ed Soja sees LA as a global city with a more balanced division between high-tech industry and finance. This is consistent with Los Angeles as a technopolis, that's Alan Scott's terminology from UCLA, and a center for all sorts of high-tech engineering and fashion designing. This idea, which suggests the need for lots of creative, innovative, symbolic analysts, to use Robert Reich's terminology, the old Secretary of Labor, the first Secretary of Labor under Clinton, is also consistent with LA fulfilling a unique role as perhaps the world center for cultural production, like over across the street here. Now, we can claim that a world that takes its cultural cues from over across the street is kind of a dismal place, a debased place, perhaps. But it is clear that LA-based film and TV, the LA-based film and TV industrial complex dominates the globe. And cultural production in LA includes not just movies and sitcoms and Baywatch, but also auto body design and the California look in fashion designing and electronics and a number of other high-tech clusters of industries. In Alan Scott's book, he's got maps showing where auto design, for instance, is concentrated in LA, and it's an industry that's almost exclusively in Southern California for a lot of the different auto companies, including the European ones. This dominance in a cultural sense is an interesting avenue, or I suppose we're in LA, boulevard, to follow. But my guess is that a careful study of the Hollywood production complex and all its ancillary industries would show a polarizing dynamic. Some very wealthy people and lots of low-wage service providers of various kinds. Similar to what Sasson describes for New York City around the financial and business corporate complexes. But I'm not going to talk about that. Instead, I'm going to take a little bit different direction and focus on LA as a crossroads or a gateway to the Pacific Rim. I think recent literature on global cities has tended to downplay the role these places can play as conduits of global trade. And we know from even the simplest formulations of globalization, that global trade is growing very quickly in importance. U.S.-Asia trade has been growing very fast in the 1990s, particularly before November or December of last year in the crises in those countries. Some quick data. In 1993, data from 1993, arbitrarily selected. It's data that I happen to have. I didn't look up the latest data. I apologize. But the 1993 data, U.S.-Europe trade, $239 billion worth of trade. U.S.-Asia trade, $361 billion, so quite a bit larger. And in fact, growing much faster than the trade with other parts of the world. Driven by this growth, LA's two ports, Long Beach and Los Angeles, or San Pedro, surpassed New York as the U.S. busiest commercial port, if you put the two of them together. In fact, that happened in 1989. This became the biggest port complex in the United States. In 1992, during a California recession, some of you may remember, the two ports were an economic bright spot, handling $114 billion worth of goods. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach combined were the third largest container ports in the world in 1992. Mindful of the key role of this shipping, local governments and politicians have secured major funding for various improvements in the Alameda Corridor to facilitate more efficient rail and truck access to the two ports. Okay, and that's a big deal, as we probably all know about the Alameda Corridor and the development thereof and all the debates about what should be done. 60% of the containers that arrive in Los Angeles, Long Beach are transshipped by truck or train to other parts of the United States. LAX is also a crucial port. We don't think of it as a port. We think of it sometimes as a pain to have to fly through. And we think of it as a passenger terminal primarily. But in fact, in addition to being a major passenger hub, which is something, by the way, that showed up on the the table that I put up before, the airport is also now the busiest air cargo center in the United States. Air cargo has grown by 50% in the last decade and was already at 1.4 million tons in 1994. This is much smaller in tonnage, no doubt, than the amount of trade that goes through the seaports. But air freight, of course, is always much more valuable than oceanic trade. So the 1992 dollar value was $32 billion, which was about 30% of the cost of the seaports trade. So basically, it's about a third of the trade that goes through the two seaports goes through the port of Los Angeles Airport. Air freight at LAX is associated directly with 5,000 jobs and brings an estimated $11 billion input to the Southern California economy. In early 1995, myself and two other Southern California-based sociologists, Rich Applebaum of UC Santa Barbara and Edna Bonasich of UC Riverside, proposed a large research project to the National Science Foundation called Inequality in a Global City, Ports, Politics, and Power in Los Angeles. What we wanted to do was link up LA as a global entrepot to changing socioeconomic conditions in the city. We were particularly eager to see what effects the Alameda Corridor project would have on employment, what types of jobs would be created, whether different racial or ethnic groups would be differentially advantaged, etc. In short, we wanted to study a sort of experiment, in a way, of a world city in the making. in Los Angeles. We wanted to test the notion that the world's cities' functions generate inequality. And we also hoped to figure out who the key actors were in all this. Because, and this is something that's important sometimes in urban sociology where we talk about equations and statistics and abstract theories, because people, not abstract forces, shape cities. There always are actors that are doing the stuff, and that's an important thing to keep in mind that sometimes gets lost. A sad truth in academia, though, and particularly in social science and sociology, is the competition for research money is intense and review processes sometimes don't work. Though most of the grant reviewers were favorable, a couple were strongly negative to our proposal. One reviewer, who thought he detected a Marxist bias in our proposal, horrors, could not believe that we would suggest that there was a dark underside to the dynamism of a global city, of the growth of a global city like LA. Now, obviously, this person hadn't visited lately, and apparently he was unaware of some events that occurred in April 1992. At any rate, we didn't get the money, and our ambitious project never got carried out. But I would suggest that the ports and the Alameda Corridor project are fertile ground for sociological research on global cities and are a good manifestation of the kind of processes that urban social scientists are interested in when they talk about world cities and global cities. Before closing, though, I do want to mention a smaller, much less ambitious research project that did get done. It was an attempt to link the big forces of global economic restructuring to a particular manufacturing sector and the lives of specific workers. I mean, that's one of the troubling things about globalization. Thank you. Yeah, in the way. One of the things that's difficult, I think, is that when you talk about globalization, you're talking about these big forces, and yet what's really, where the impact is on local areas and on individual people's lives. And it's hard to make all those links. As researchers, it's difficult to convince people that changes that are happening in a particular industry or a particular sector at a local level are linked up. But we tried to do this in this study. We studied the Los Angeles garment industry. In a recent paper called Making of a Third World City, Getz Wolf provides lots of data and charts and graphs on how much of Los Angeles's industrial growth is leading to lower wage workforce and one that is increasingly Latino. Wolf's data from the early 1990s show that the garment industry, employing about 100,000 workers, is the second largest employer in the metropolitan Los Angeles area and growing fast. And in fact, probably it's now number one. The garment industry is rapidly closing in, and again, by now has probably passed. The aerospace industry is the biggest employer. According to Wolf, 84% of all garment workers are Latino and 13% are Asian American. Wolf says, quote, officially reported wages were an average of $6.90 an hour in December 1991, but these were inflated because they do not take into account the estimated 25,000 or so informal sector jobs in sweatshops and homework employment who are earning sub-minimum wages. Thanks to Los Angeles garments industry's special national role in the design and marketing of women's wear, this low-wage, high-productivity labor force has grown by an incredible 23% since 1979, while the apparel industry has declined 22% nationwide. The garment industry in LA has a very distinctive hierarchical structure. I've got another graph that sort of illustrates this. Not a slide, but a graph. At least it's something. This is the structure of the garment industry. I don't know whether I can get that piece of paper to stay there. There we go. Let me just talk through it a little bit. The thing that's interesting about the garment industry is at the top are what they call the manufacturers, okay? And I should use my little red dot thingy, shouldn't I? The manufacturers are sort of at the top of the industry, although you can see that, you know, you've got your retail and your department stores and things like that. But the interesting thing about manufacturers in the garment industry is they don't manufacture anything. They don't produce anything. The manufacturers. In this sector, manufacturers don't produce. Instead, they design garment prototypes, arrange financing, and take care of advertising. These are the brand names, the people controlling the brand names who make the big profits and do the advertising, but they don't actually produce anything except maybe prototypes. The next level in the LA garment industry are the contractors. I'm going to leave out jobbers. That's a complication I'm not going to talk about tonight. These are people that are sort of similar in some ways to, well, they're sort of in between contractors, and it's not I'm just not going to talk about it. The contractors, though, are the people who actually own and run factories, or often more accurately, the sweatshops, where the sewing actually gets done. You can see, and it's kind of hard to see, but the sewing, it says sewing here, and even I'm having trouble reading that, but that's basically the financial end. While most of the big players in the apparel industry are Anglos in LA, a large proportion of the contractors are Asian American. This hierarchy is not just a hierarchy of economic functions, but it's also an ethnic or racial hierarchy as well. Finally, at the bottom of the garment sector are the workers, poorly paid and overwhelmingly Latino, according to Wolf's metro area data. Okay, so what we tried to do, I mean, we have this kind of structure, skeletal structure of the industry, and we've got Wolf's data on the general patterns. And what we tried to do, myself and some doctoral students at UCI, was to take a closer look at the contractors and workers in one segment of the garment industry. We looked at Korean American run factories in the downtown garment district. The district is a few square blocks of rather old, low-slung, run-down buildings just east of downtown. And it's bounded by Olive, 7th, and Maple Street and the Santa Monica Freeway. This would have been a good time, I suppose, to have a map, but I didn't bring one, sorry. I don't have any slides of these buildings, again, sorry, but I will say that I don't think many of these buildings are architectural masterpieces. But they are fairly functional, with big open floors for sewing shops. We did an ethnographic study with in-depth interviews of both 100 Korean American contractors, which one of my students, Kusup Chin, carried out essentially. And we also did a random on-the-street set of interviews with a number of their workers, about 65 workers altogether, where we interviewed them as they came out of their buildings at the end of the day. All interviews were conducted in either Korean or Spanish. I can't possibly try to summarize what we learned. The complete report is in a couple of papers that are on their way to becoming articles, and it's in Mr. Chin's doctoral dissertation. But quickly summarizing, we found that the subcontractors were making middle-class incomes, about half were making $50,000 a year or a little more. And most of these factory men, and by the way, they were almost all male, felt squeezed by the intense competition brought to bear on them by the buyers, by the folks, by the manufacturers, and some of these people up at the top level of the hierarchy. The contractors were squeezed. They're under enormous economic pressure to meet delivery dates and lower their selling prices. If they don't work fast and cheap, they often lose their contracts. And in fact, now, as somebody has mentioned, I think Eric may have mentioned in his remarks in passing, these contractors now are also competing with garment factories in Mexico. Increasingly, a lot of the people in the LA industry are starting to move their production to Mexico, particularly, and that's facilitated by NAFTA. They lower prices essentially by finding ways, the contractors lower prices essentially by finding ways to reduce wages and piece rates for workers, avoid paying workers at slack times, hiring workers who are uneducated and undocumented, and violating various labor and safety laws. These contractors are often depicted as the bad guys. And about this time of our study, 3 or 4 years ago, the State Department of Labor raided some of these factories and found many labor law violations. And usually, sometimes when they do, they bring in the news camera and they show the Korean guy or the Chinese guy, you know, covering his face. And, you know, the whole image that one gets is that these people are the problem. But our paper argues that these contractors are, in effect, caught in the middle. The manufacturers and designers of the California look want to be able to have local garment production that they can monitor. And in fact, this is part of a global city dynamic. These people are here, they're taking advantage of some of the amenities and the fact that there's sort of a design complex in LA, in Southern California, and they want to be able to do the stuff close by. And the result is the generation of this type of industry that ends up producing these kinds of conditions. They've made, the manufacturers made the sector intensely competitive for these ethnic entrepreneurs, but they maintain an arm's length relationship with the factories, claiming that they're not responsible when labor laws are violated. So if Mr. Kim's factory gets raided, you know, the people at the Gap or at J.C. Penney's claim that they don't know anything about it, even though there's racks of clothes with their labels on it that Mr. Kim's workers are sewing. Our surveys of workers underline the general pattern that Getzwolf described. The workers that we interviewed, again, 65 in all, averaged 23 years of age. Most were very recent arrivals. 55% spoke no English. One half had less than 6 years of any formal education. And 70% earned minimum wage or less. And in fact, the average was about $3 an hour when we figured it all out. Here's some data that, actually this data is some data that Mr. Chin, Kusup Chin collected from these are estimates by the Korean contractors of the wages. And you can figure out how that works out per hour. It's not minimum wage even for the people in the unskilled categories. We did not directly ask about migration status, but clearly most of these people were not documented. One Korean contractor, the Korean contractors in general agreed with this. One said, quote, "Speaking frankly, I believe that 2/3 of the workers in my factory are illegal." Some recent reports in the LA Times business section have hailed the growing garment sector in the city as a hopeful sign, and they want officials to try to maintain these jobs, which again, maybe some of which are leaving to go to Mexico because of NAFTA. But our small study suggests another aspect of the global city formation that is, and that is that it has the effect of creating some growth and wealth production for a few people while creating deeper inequality and perhaps growing ethnic divisions as well. Okay, to conclude, tonight I've tried to knit together some strands of research on LA as a global city. I've moved from the big picture macro level to a discussion of the city's anthropo functions to an illustration of how economic restructuring has impacted a particular industry and the people within that industry. It's all rather fragmentary, even inconclusive. My attempt, though, was to try to link the global to the local, and I think that's the key here in both research and also in thinking about these things, trying to figure out that kind of linkage, which sometimes is not very easy to see, by the way. What should we, or you in particular, make of this? At one level, LA's global city status does demand a certain sort of built environment, an infrastructure that is in sync with the functional demands that are put upon this place. Informational cities and or global entrepôts demand certain systems of transportation, communication, smart buildings, etc. And so do fashion and design centers, and so do cultural complexes. But at another level, as my talk suggests, the dynamics of economic globalization and the push towards global city status are actually promoting the socioeconomic growth of a very divided city, a polarized place with high levels of inequality. The rise of gated communities and urban fortresses, the kind of urban fortresses that Mike Davis describes, are at least partially a response to this attendant polarization, I would argue. Perhaps all of us need to resist an easy acceptance of various types of globalization as inevitable, the global neoliberal arguments, and seek ways that we can promote less economic, class, and racial and ethnic divisions within a city like LA. But suggesting ways to do that would be a different topic, the topic of another talk, and one that I'm not prepared to give tonight. Thank you. If anybody, should I take questions, or if anyone has any particular questions they'd like to ask, I'd be glad to try to respond. Except I can't see people. I usually lecture to these big lecture halls and I can see. Yeah.
In response about, is there anything that we as architects and urban planners can help to augment this polarization, which seemingly may not necessarily stop
Right.
the economic movements?
You know, I was trying to think about this as I was writing the talk, and I told Eric and Neil, you know, in some ways I don't pretend to know what the answer is in terms of how architects should respond to this, or urban planners. I think it's an economic dynamic that's sort of above and beyond, you know, anything that design itself can deal with. But I'm sure that there are some things, and I guess what I would hope is that people would think about that seriously and try to problematize it. I think one of the things that I'm trying to challenge is this idea that that it's all inevitable and that there's nothing that can be done about it, and again, suggesting that a lot of it is very ideological driven. You know, it's in material interest of certain people to have the development of the Alameda corridor, you know, and we need to be aware of that as citizens and as, you know, in our various functions, whether it's designing stuff or as architects or whatever. But I don't have a good answer, I guess, to your question, and I hope maybe some other people can suggest some things. Yeah?
So would you say that the global city has nothing to do with place anymore?
Has nothing to...
With place?
No, I think on the contrary, it does have to do with place. I mean, one of the things that Sasson argues is that there's this idea that you can have kind of a virtual global city, and then everything becomes disembodied. And what Sasson argues in her book, pretty persuasively, I think, is that at the higher levels of command and control, face-to-face interactions are still pretty important. You know, you can do certain things over the computer or the phone or the fax, but there are certain things involving relationships of trust where you have to look into somebody's eyes and see how they respond. In the garment industry, you know, they talk about how certain centers are still very important because you have to touch the fabric, you know, and you have to actually have face-to-face interactions. So I think places are still pretty important. I think that's why places like New York and London and Tokyo have become so important. There's an awful lot of stuff going on in a very small part of Manhattan that's sort of in control of a lot of the world economy. And it's not just an accident that it all concentrates there. There are things, in fact, that still are best done face-to-face. So I think the place still is important. Now, maybe the kinds of things that determined where cities were, for instance, before are different. You know, the built environment in some ways has freed us from some of the other kinds of constraints, but, you know. Well, they could. I'm not sure I'd argue that, but I mean, I think the Ecology of Fear book argues that maybe this isn't a good place for a city. So there's certainly, I mean, we do live in a natural world, and there are things that can happen that are bad, or that can, you know, resources, we're still constrained by resources, even though we think that we live in a postmodern world where that's not the case. But I guess the main argument that I would make is that there's sort of a cumulative effect. I mean, once you start getting clusters of people in a certain kind of, in a place that are, you know, making the command and control type decisions, the kind of experts for a corporate service structure, you know, the people who are creating the new world economy, they tend to cluster together. So there's sort of cumulative causation in all this. In Sasson's latest book it's called Losing Control, she talks about how the world economy is being created by the instruments, the legal instruments, and some of the financial instruments are being created by lawyers and accountants, again, in places like Manhattan, you know, where they're intensely in communication with each other. And once you have that, that's going to draw more people of that kind in. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that fully answers your question, but I think that places are still very important. Other? Yeah.
I'd like to touch on the issue of environment. That's certainly central to your research.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to start by reminding everyone of the first graph that you showed, that if it weren't for Johannesburg, Africa would have disappeared entirely from the map.
Yeah.
And it brings up the question of the fact of the inverse condition of
oops, speaking of inverse.
the provincial condition, which is in the binary between the world city, which is articulated by a series of points, whether they're 100-mile radii, 60-mile radii. We know that between Johannesburg and Central Europe lies a sort of vast conceptual Kampala or Siberia, an quote-unquote unproductive place. This may be unfair, or I might point out in America, let's say, Louisiana, the Deep South, places where economies, forms of education are quote-unquote not nearly as productive, yet here they are as part of the landscape, so to speak. What's the relation of these provincial areas relative to inequality in a way, or is it cities only that generate that?
Well, I think that what's happening with the periphery, I mean, I think this is part of this restructuring, this global restructuring. It seems to me that in the past, we had these national economies, and within national economies, you had some areas that were used essentially as places where there was cheap labor. So when I was in grad school in North Carolina, you know, there were some people who thought the free flow of capital was great because a lot of the manufacturing was being relocated from the Northeast down into the South, you know, and this was a good thing. It was going to lead to the development of the South. Of course, they were forgetting that some of it kept going south, you know, and they kind of passed through on I-95 and kept right on going. But I think now, in this new globalized economy, you have a situation where you have this new global division of labor, and in fact, there is a tremendous amount of production that's being, you know, in an industry, for instance, like the garment industry, people are going farther and farther from the centers to make price, okay? So there's a chart in one of my colleagues' papers that he gave at the sociology meetings this summer, where he has all these circles, and the outer circles are places like Mongolia and the Maldive Islands, and these are the new frontiers, you know, and as soon as the infrastructure is in place, that's where they're going to go for some of this low-wage manufacturing. In fact, education doesn't matter for this stuff. These people are being used essentially as very low-wage workers. It's the Doonesbury type thing with Indonesia. But the problem is, of course, does that lead to development? Well, no, it doesn't lead to real development. It leads to further impoverishment of these people. Oftentimes they get pulled out of the rural, you know, their subsistence economy, and you know, the Indonesian case is a good example. You've got a country that's become quote industrialized in this kind of way, and now it's in the toilet economically, and you've got massive hunger. You know, I mean, I read in the paper today, I think, that the GNP has fallen below, per capita is below Bangladesh's. Indonesia. So you've got this situation of a very uneven world, basically. Now, if you go to Jakarta, and you're in the city there, you know, you got the high-rise buildings, you got tremendously wealthy people. There are some people that made out quite well, but in fact, this has been a process of overdevelopment of the city in some ways, and yet tremendous polarization and inequality at the same time. So I guess I would argue that in the periphery, you have a lot of inequality as well. I mean, the global city may generate certain kinds of inequality that isn't, you know, you may have certain kinds of inequality in London and Tokyo that maybe aren't present in outpost, you know, smaller cities in the United States or in the United Kingdom. But in fact, within the periphery, you have tremendous levels of impoverishment. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, it's a myth, the idea that the old modernization myth that, you know, industrialization is spreading to all parts of the world, and that's, you know, all the ships are going to rise. I mean, pretty clear right now that that's not the case. So, I mean, Africa's an interesting case too. Africa seems to not even attract the investment. It seems to be sort of the lost continent. I'm not sure what to make of it. We just edited a book, myself and a couple colleagues at Irvine, on states and sovereignty in the world, in the global system. And the African states basically had no sovereignty at all because they were just so underdeveloped, and there's so much political instability that the investors won't even go in, and it's, you know, it's a real problem. I mean, on the one hand, you want to. I'm not sure what the answer is, because the investment that has gone into poor countries has not necessarily generated development either. I guess there is some hope that states can have some countervailing effect. You know, if you have a state bureaucracy that can negotiate with capital to some extent, sometimes you can have some positive spin-offs. That's part of the story of South Korea and India to some extent, some of the successes they've had. So, which is, again, one of the reasons why the global neoliberal project of destroying the state everywhere is worrisome too. Okay. Yeah.
Which leads to the question that you're talking about, is there real conflict? Is the conflict that I would agree Mark Davis so articulately described in his work, there's not perhaps a real conflict between existing national community, sense of community, and that sense of community against emerging transnational community?
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I think that classes are international or global. You know, I mean, and there are class alliances between those wealthy people in Jakarta and, I don't know, transnational capitalist classes or whatever. And it seems to me that that when Davis talks about the political and class divisions in Los Angeles, that he's not wrong, but that you could try to connect it up with some of these global dynamics too, possibly. It's one of the things when I taught the book in a course, we tried to think about how might we hook up with some global types of analysis. So I'm not sure that they're opposed to each other necessarily. I think what we're seeing increasingly, I mean, the whole critique of the world system analysis is that it talked about core and periphery nations, and it said the core nations were sort of like a class, and they were all working against the peripheral nations. In fact, we know that underdevelopment in the periphery often occurs with very high levels of cooperation between the Marcoses and the Suhartos and in fact, that's a very important part of the whole process. So it's not really a nation versus nation kind of thing. It's a little more complicated than that, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I think your point is, and I couldn't quite hear you, but I think your point is that that life really was bad for workers in the last century in many of the industrial countries, and yet then things changed and the conditions got better, and so we might expect this to happen again. Is that? Mm-hmm. Well, just a quick answer to the second question, and it's an anecdotal one, probably totally unsatisfying. We went and visited a garment factory in the Pearl River Delta, not too far from in Guangdong area, and we went and interviewed the workers, and we wanted to go and see the housing that they'd built. A lot of these were women migrants from northern parts of China who'd come to Guangdong, and they wouldn't let us see the housing. So, it's pretty clear to me that a lot of that much of this third world industrial development in places like China and Indonesia and Vietnam and places like that, that there's not a high level of planning and of welfare provision and housing and things like that. In fact, a lot of it, you go to a big EPZ, export processing zone outside of Jakarta, and there's shanties everywhere. So I suppose it's possible it could happen at some point, but that doesn't seem. One of the things that's driving that is that there's this intense pressure to lower costs, and if you start providing a lot of stuff like that doesn't happen. Now, why is that? Well, I think part of it is because of the sort of different circuits of, the regulationist school where you don't have a Fordist thing, you've got something that's post-Fordist, and there's sort of a break between the consumers and the producers, you know, and the old Fordist model, the idea was that Henry Ford's workers were also going to be consumers of the cars, and that sort of led to this ratcheting up of the standard of living, and there was this national economy. Well, now you don't have that kind of situation, at least for the time being. Now, various Marxist theorists will say, well, that's not a stable situation. That's going to lead to, you know, some kind of a big problem. But you don't get that impression. You get the impression that as soon as wages start to rise, people start to organize, conditions start to get better, that in many of these industries, particularly this most routine low-wage ones, they move on to the next place. It makes it very hard to organize and improve. Yeah.
One thing that you inferred in the article, Mapping the World City, was the idea that beyond the sociology of cities was a new emerging sociology of the linkages.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You didn't speak a lot about that, but it seems like perhaps that's an area.
Yeah. Right. This is a trend in sociology. I'm not sure everybody heard the question, but it was about the idea of a sociology of linkages or networks. And it certainly is an important trend. I mean, the sociologists of organizations and of development and even of sociometry, you know, the friendship networks and social psychology are increasingly looking at people's inner connections with other people. Instead of looking at folks as individuals and sort of measuring all your different traits like in a survey, you know, your demographics and all that, people are increasingly trying to figure out how to look at these networks of connections and how to model that kind of stuff and how to, because really, I mean, that's the way society works, really. We aren't just autonomous individuals that do things, you know, as individuals. We do things because we're influenced by our friends or our neighbors or our connections, or businesses get things done because they have links. There's a famous article about how people get employment called The Strength of Weak Ties, which talks about how, by a guy named Mark Granovetter, talks about how you're most likely to get a job not from your close friends, but through your uncle's cousin in Milwaukee, who happens to find out about a job. It's, you know, and the reason the weak tie works the best is because they have access to information that you don't have. If you're tightly linked to people, you probably have the same information, whereas the weak tie. So in sociology, there is this development of increasing interest towards looking at networked connections, not just trade or air passenger flows, but also people's interpersonal connections. We're doing this project we're doing on industrial upgrading in Asia. We're looking at business networks, and of course it's obvious that one of the things that's happening in Asia is overseas Chinese seem to be doing very well in many of the countries, and the argument is that, well, there's two arguments. The old argument is, oh, culture. Those Chinese, they have a certain kind of culture, and they're really good at business. But the more persuasive sociological argument, I think, is that they have certain kinds of familial and other non-kin networks that link them up across the whole area. And if you start talking to people, that does seem to be what comes out, you know. Yeah.
I'm curious, you started out by saying that practically all of the discourses of globalization are ideological. I think we would grant that. I'm curious about the ideological underpinnings of the kind of critiques that Sass and scholars like yourself make of global cities, because one of the things that seems to be left out, and one of the things that seems to be offered kind of say is the return of manufacturing jobs. I mean, in other words, critique of global cities is precisely that manufacturing jobs and the manufacturing sector has been disappeared, which is two absolutely conflictual and absolute forces, very wealthy people,
Right.
architects, etc., and migrant workers and others.
That was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, by the way, when I tossed in architects as one of the group of very wealthy people. I'm sure there are some, but I'm
But to continue the point, and Ryder's book, which you cite,
Right.
Offers an analysis which suggests that, and it's an old analysis, which suggests that manufacturing is in fact not any kind of solution, because it's precisely labor as it is changing the world by the manufacturing sector.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm curious about is what kind of more positive
Right.
analysis
Right.
or solutions
Right.
like yourself offer other than
Okay. Well, I mean, two reactions. One is, somebody asked me about what it was like to be in Orange County, and this question sort of reminds me of that in a way. I mean, to debunk globalization as sort of this program is really, I think, an important thing, because it's taken for granted. This morning in the Times, there was some quotes from people about what had to be done in these poor countries that were having all these difficulties in Asia, and there was a matter-of-fact sentence that said, of course, they have to move towards more free markets and more open investment climates. You know, so it's very hegemonic, this ideology. Everybody just takes it for granted, of course. So I think part of what's happening here is sociology is sort of debunking, saying, well, wait a minute, let's look at the facts. You know, the Joe Friday approach, the facts, ma'am, you know, nothing but the facts. Let's take a look and see if they line up. Well, maybe they don't, and that, I think, in itself is useful. Now, in terms of answers, I think that's more problematic. It seems to me, for instance, I would not argue that the key to making New York City viable again is to bring manufacturing back. That would not be an argument that I would make. On the other hand, I think that one thing that would help the global situation would be for workers in the United States to help workers in other countries to organize and to try to push our political leaders to come up with you know, a World Trade Organization that's going to take into effect things like labor and environmental standards and make sure that those things are really enforced in other places. The U.S. labor movement, by the way, is pretty bad about this. You know, in the past we've kind of been social movements in various places. So that might be something. The point is that people, if people anywhere in the world are being really exploited, that it's probably going to have negative effects that are going to redound here. I mean, you know, part of this paper on the sweatshops in LA, we sort of framed it around the anti-immigration spirit in Southern California. And our argument was, hey, you know, this nativism is totally misconstrued, because these people are not the enemy. That, you know, the thing is to try to upgrade, you know, across the board. And our current research project in East Asia is trying to figure out how societies in East Asia and groups of companies and things like that can have constructive upgrading policies. You know, how can you get to higher levels of technology and better wage conditions, et cetera. Now, the problem with that, of course, is one of the ways might be that, you know, you move up in the hierarchy and other people are still at the bottom. That's not a very good answer. I guess, you know, we're not in the business particularly of trying, I mean, we're trying to understand how structures work, and we're not, perhaps it's a good critique that we haven't been as attentive to coming up with positive solutions, you know. So I think that's probably the case. I don't think people would say get the manufacturing back into the.
No, but it's an absence of manufacturing that leads to the kind of polarization.
Well, I think it's the absence of that, but also it's the polarization is also created by the fact that very wealthy people are being subsidized in various ways and allowed to accumulate huge amounts of wealth. And one could argue for some kind of real redistribution of wealth that is not dictated solely by market value of people or by, you know, paper transactions or whatever. I mean, it's an anti-capitalist critique, obviously, but you know, that you could make that argument. I mean, there's no reason for people to bring more manufacturing back to New York City. I mean, the manufacturing can be done other places, but there's also, it seems to me that it's also sort of inexcusable that in a society that has a GNP per capita of, what, $30,000 or something per year, that we've got people in parts of the Bronx whose infant mortality rates are higher than Haiti's. You know, there's something wrong. And I'm not sure that we need to just look at economic solutions to that. It seems to me we need to look at political solutions to that. We need to demand more of our political system to say we want to have redistribution. We want programs that are going to help people to avoid these kinds of problems. And education is a good thing, but when you educate people and then there aren't jobs, that's not a particularly compelling solution either. So, anyway. Anything else? Maybe people are ready to quit. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Enjoyed the talk.